The morning sun of April 10th, 1912, broke over the bustling docks of Southampton with a golden clarity that seemed to promise a new era of human achievement. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray and coal smoke as thousands of people gathered to witness the departure of the largest moving object ever built by human hands. The RMS Titanic stood against the horizon like a literal mountain of steel and hope, its four massive buff-colored funnels reaching toward the sky while the white paint of its upper decks gleamed with a pristine brilliance that felt almost divine. Everywhere you looked there was a sense of quiet grandeur as the rhythmic clanging of distant bells, and the lull of the crowd created a hypnotic atmosphere of anticipation. Families stood on the pier waving handkerchiefs that fluttered like white birds in the breeze, while the heavy thrum of the ship's internal systems began to vibrate through the wooden planks of the dock. It was a time of immense optimism, when technology felt like a benevolent force that could conquer the very oceans. The American passengers felt particular pride as they looked upon this marvel of engineering that was destined for New York City. The sheer scale of the ship was hypnotic to behold, as the rows of portholes stretched endlessly along the black hull like the eyes of a sleeping giant. Inside the ship, the air was cool and smelled of fresh varnish and expensive leather. The grand staircase waited in silence for the footfalls of the wealthy, while the deep velvet carpets muffled the sound of the world outside. As the mooring ropes were cast off, the sound of the water churning against the hull was a deep and rhythmic pulse. The ship moved with slow and deliberate grace that felt more like the rotation of the earth than a man-made vessel. Every inch of the ship was designed for comfort and stability, which gave the passengers a profound sense of security as they watched the shoreline of England slowly recede into a hazy blue mist. The gentle vibration of the triple expansion engines was a soothing mechanical heartbeat that resonated through the soles of their shoes and into their very bones. As the sun began its slow descent, the sky turned into a canvas of soft violets and deep oranges reflecting off the calm surface of the English Channel. The dining saloon was a sea of white linen and sparkling crystal with a clinking of silverware, and the low murmur of polite conversation created a cocoon of luxury. Outside, the wind was a soft whisper against the glass as the Titanic found its stride in the open water. The stars began to appear one by one, piercing the darkening canopy of the sky with a cold and steady light. There was no moon that night to distract from the vastness of the cosmos above, which made the ship feel like a solitary planet drifting through a silent void. The water parted before the bow with a soft, hushing sound like a long, drawn-out breath. In the lower decks, the rhythmic shoveling of coal by the firemen was a steady and hypnotic cadence that kept the heart of the ship beating. The transition from the vibrant energy of the docks to the serene isolation of the Atlantic was seamless and calming. Passengers retreated to their cabins where the wood paneling glowed in the soft light of the electric lamps. The bedding was crisp and cool to the touch, and the gentle swaying of the ship was so subtle it felt like being rocked in a massive cradle. Time seemed to slow down. As the ship moved further away from the noise of the world and deeper into the embrace of the ocean, the vastness of the Atlantic was not a threat, but peaceful expanse that stretched toward the horizon in every direction. The air on the boat deck was crisp and clean, filling the lungs with a refreshing chill that made the warmth of the interior feel even more inviting. As the days passed, the routine of the ship became a form of meditation. The morning walks on the deck under a pale sun, followed by the quiet afternoons in the library where the only sound was the turning of pages. The vibration of the engines remained constant, an unchanging, reliable reminder of the ship's steady progress toward the west. The ocean was a deep indigo that seemed to hold the secrets of centuries within its depths. Every wave was a soft undulation that passed by without effort. The officers on the bridge watched the horizon with a calm and steady gaze, their silhouettes dark against the starlight. The wireless operators listened to the rhythmic clicks of Morse code, like a digital rain falling in the silence of the night. Even as the ship entered the colder waters of the North Atlantic, the sense of peace remained unshaken. The icebergs that floated in the distance were like silent white sentinels carved from glass and moonlight. The ship's path was a straight line of purpose, cutting through the stillness with a quiet confidence. The grand piano in the lounge played soft melodies that drifted through the hallways like a memory. The smell of roasted coffee and fresh bread wafted from the kitchens, providing a sense of domestic comfort in the middle of the wilderness. As the ship approached the final stretch of its journey, the atmosphere became even more hushed and reverent. The passengers felt a deep connection to the vessel that carried them through the dark, as if the Titanic were a living being protecting them from the elements. The steel walls were a fortress of tranquility against a vast and indifferent sea. The The stars reflected in the water so perfectly that it was hard to tell where the sky ended and the ocean began. The ship moved through this mirror-like world with a silent majesty that defied description. The rhythmic sound of the water against the hull was the only lullaby needed for those resting within. The dreams of the travelers were filled with the promise of a new world and the echoes of the old world fading away. The Titanic was not just a ship, but a floating sanctuary of stillness in a fast-changing world. The heavy doors of the engine room muffled the roar of the furnaces into a distant and comforting growl. The brass fixtures throughout the ship gleamed with a soft golden light that felt like a warm embrace. As the midnight hour approached, the ship seemed to breathe with the ocean itself. The cold air outside was still and breathless, as if the world were holding its breath in. All of the moment, the white wake behind the ship was a long and fading trail of foam that disappeared into the darkness. The captain stood on the wing of the bridge, feeling the bite of the frost and the absolute silence of the sea. There was profound beauty in the isolation of the North Atlantic, a beauty that spoke of the infinite and the eternal. The ship continued its steady march forward, oblivious to the passage of time or the worries of the land. Every rivet and plate of steel was a testament to the quiet strength of the human spirit. The soft hum of the ventilation system was a constant companion to the sleeping passengers. The corridors were long and silent stretches of carpet and where the shadows danced gently in the dim light. The heavy silk curtains in the staterooms blocked out the starlight, creating a private world of darkness and rest. As the Titanic moved through the night, it became a part of the ocean's own rhythm, a slow and majestic dance between the water and the steel. The coldness of the exterior only served to highlight the warmth and safety found within the ship's heart. The journey was a passage through time itself, a moment of suspended animation where nothing mattered but the steady pulse of the engines and the vastness of the horizon. The stars seemed to descend lower as if to touch the mass of the great ship. The silence was not empty, but full of the deep resonance of the sea. The Titanic was a masterpiece of balance and poise, moving with a grace that was both powerful and fragile. The ocean accepted the ship into its depths with a quiet grace of its own. The water was so still it looked like black velvet stretched across the world. The ship's lights were a string of pearls cast upon the water, illuminating the mist that clung to the surface. The journey was a meditation on the scale of the universe and the smallness of man, yet within the walls of the ship there was a sense of infinite possibility. The steady rhythm of the voyage was a balm for the soul, a reminder of the peace that can be found in the middle of a great journey. The Titanic sailed on through the night, a silent witness to the beauty of the dark and the power of the deep. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, the ship remained a steady and unwavering presence in the vastness of the sea. The world was quiet and the ship was at peace. The heavy oak doors of the first-class suite swung on silent hinges to reveal worlds of deep mahogany and polished marble, where the air always felt perfectly still and scented with a faint aroma of fresh lilies and expensive tobacco. Every surface was a testament to the artisans who had labored to create a sanctuary of absolute calm amidst the churning power of the North Atlantic. The walls were adorned with intricate silk tapestries that muffled the already distant hum of the engines until the world felt as quiet as a library at midnight. Plush velvet armchairs in shades of deep emerald and royal blue stood ready to embrace their occupants with a softness that seemed to defy gravity. The light from the silver-plated lamps was warm and golden, casting long, gentle shadows across the hand-woven Persian rugs that lay thick upon the floors. Here time was measured not by the ticking of clock, but by the slow movement of the sun across the private promenades where the elite could walk, in solitude while wrapped in heavy furs. Several decks below the rhythm of the ship changed into something more communal and grounded as the third-class quarters vibrated with a different kind of energy. The air in steerage was filled with the sounds of a dozen different languages, blending into a low and rhythmic hum that felt like a heartbeat of a growing nation. There were the soft lullabies of mothers from Scandinavia and the hushed whispers of hopeful men from the rolling hills of Ireland, all bound together by the same steel hull and the same destination. The iron bunks were simple and sturdy, draped with heavy wool blankets that provided a coarse but honest warmth against the damp chill of the sea. The floors were scrubbed clean, and the smell of fresh bread from the nearby galley provided a sense of domestic comfort that transcended the boundaries of class. In the grand dining saloon of first class, the clinking of fine-boned china was a delicate music that accompanied conversations about industry and art, while the stewards moved like shadows to ensure that no glass remained empty. The The crystal chandeliers overhead swayed with a rhythmic grace that mirrored the gentle roll of the ship, creating a hypnotic dance of light upon the white linen tablecloths. Meanwhile, in the steerage common rooms, a fiddle might begin to play a slow and mournful tune that reminded everyone of the homes they had left behind, while simultaneously promising a future of endless possibility. The immigrants sat on wooden benches sharing stories of the farms they would own and the cities they would build, their eyes bright, with a quiet determination that no ocean could wash away. Despite the vast difference in their surroundings, every soul on board was connected by the steady vibration of the triple expansion engines that pulsed the floorboards like a constant reassurance of progress. The ship was a microcosm of the world itself, a vertical city, where the highest peaks and the deepest foundations moved in perfect unison toward the west. As the evening fog began to roll over the water, the lights from the upper decks glowed like a celestial crown, while the portholes of the lower decks twinkled like a row of steady stars just above the waterline. The social boundaries that seemed so rigid on land began to soften in the vastness of the sea, where the horizon was the same distance for everyone regardless of their ticket color. The salt air was a universal cleanser, filling the lungs of the millionaire and the mechanic alike with the same sharp and invigorating chill. In the quiet hours of the night, the silence of the first-class corridors was matched by the peaceful exhaustion of the steerage dormitories, where the dreams of a new life were woven into the steady white noise of the parting waves. The mahogany paneling of the suites and the painted iron of the lower cabins both held the same coldness of the Atlantic at bay, creating a unified bubble of human warmth in a wilderness of water. The grand staircase remained a silent monument to architectural beauty, its clock frozen in a moment of eternal elegance, while the simple wooden stairs below were polished by the feet of those who would become the backbone of the American dream. As the Titanic moved deeper into the night, the distinction between opulence and necessity began to blur into a single shared experience of transit and transformation. The soft glow of the electric lights provided a sense of safety that felt absolute, a technological shield against the ancient mysteries of the deep. Every passenger, whether resting on silk or wool, was cradled by the same rhythmic swaying that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The ocean did not distinguish between the satin slippers of a debutante and the leather boots of a laborer as it flowed past the hull in a continuous stream of dark velvet. The journey was a period of suspension, where the past was a fading memory and the future was a distant shore, leaving only the present moment of calm and steady motion. The stewards in the upper decks straightened the pillows with practiced grace, while the fathers in the lower decks tucked their children into narrow berths, with a prayer for a better tomorrow. The ship was a bridge of steel connecting two worlds, and for a few days everyone on board existed in a state of grace, where the only task was to exist and to wait. The vibration of the ship was a lullaby that spoke of strength and reliability, a mechanical promise that the destination was certain and the journey was secure. As the stars aligned over the mast of the Titanic became a silent cathedral of hope, where the silence was filled with the collective breath of 2,000 souls. The darkness outside was immense, but the light inside was a defiant spark of human, that refused to be extinguished by the cold. The contrast between the classes was not a wall, but a spectrum of the human experience, all converging toward a single point on the horizon. The smell of the sea was a constant companion, a reminder of the raw power that lay just beyond the steel plates. The luxury of the suites provided a sense of timelessness, while the simplicity of the steerage provided a sense of purpose, and together they formed a complete story of the era. The wind whistled to the rigging in a high and lonely note that was lost in the vastness of the Atlantic, while the interior of the ship remained a cocoon of warmth and light. The rhythmic clanking of the coal shovels far below was a steady drumbeat that kept the entire vessel moving forward with an unstoppable momentum. The dreams of the first class passengers were filled with the preservation of their legacy, while the dreams of the steerage were filled with the creation of something new, yet both were looking toward the same sunset with a sense of awe. The ship was a masterpiece of balance, holding the weight of 1,000 different lives with a grace that felt almost supernatural. As the clock moved toward the early hours of the morning, the entire ship settled into a deep and profound stillness, where the only sound was the rushing of the water and the occasional groan of the steel as it adjusted to pressure of the deep. The mahogany glowed and the iron rested, and the ship sailed on to the midnight blue of the North Atlantic, like a ghost of light in a world of shadows. Every soul on board was a passenger on the same grand adventure, partaking in a moment of history that felt as vast as the stars above. The journey was a testament to the idea that despite our differences, we are all moved by the same currents and guided by the same light toward a future we cannot yet see. The Titanic moved with a silent dignity that commanded respect from the waves and the wind, like a sovereign of the seas, carrying the weight of a million hopes across the threshold of the new world. As the light of the moon reflected off the polished brass, and the painted steel of the ship seemed to dissolve into the landscape of the ocean, becoming one with the water and the air and the night. The peace that descended upon the decks was a total and absolute silence of rest that was earned by the miles already traveled and the miles yet to come. The story of the ship was the story of humanity itself, moving through the dark with a steady heart and a quiet mind toward a dawn that was waiting just beyond the curve of the earth. The water hissed against the bow, and the engines hummed their low and steady song, and the ship was at peace. The rhythmic pulse of the massive triple-expansion engines deep within the hull of the Titanic created a constant and grounding vibration that felt like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. This steady thrumming was a backdrop to every moment spent on the water, providing a sense of mechanical reliability that lulled the passengers into a state of absolute security. As the morning sun climbed the sky, the light would reflect off the crystalline surface of the North Atlantic, which appeared so still and flat that it resembled a vast sheet of polished sapphire glass stretching toward infinity. There were no waves to speak of, only the gentle undulation of the deep ocean swell that lifted 1,000 tons of steel with the ease of a feather. On the boat deck, the air was crisp and carried a sharp, invigorating chill that made the heavy wool coats of the passengers feel cozy and essential. The daily routine was a slow dance of elegance and leisure, where time seemed to dissolve into the steady white noise of the parting water. In the afternoon, the sunlight would stream through the stained glass windows of the smoking room, casting colorful patterns on the rich mahogany tables, where men sat in quiet contemplation. The sound of a distant violin would drift through the hallways as the ship's orchestra practiced their repertoire of waltzes and light classical pieces, creating a soundscape of civility in the middle of the wilderness. As evening approached, the ritual of the lavish dinner began with the sound of a bugle call that echoed through the corridors, inviting everyone to a feast of multiple courses served on the finest china. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft murmur of polite laughter filled the dining saloon, while the stewards moved with a synchronized grace that made the service feel invisible and effortless. Outside, the windows of the horizon began to fade into a deep indigo as the stars emerged one by one in the sky, so clear and dark that the Milky Way looked like a river of silver dust poured across the heavens. The captain would stand on the bridge looking out over the mirror, like noting how the water didn't even break against the bow, but simply curled away in two perfect ribbons of white foam. It was a rare and haunting calm that suggested the ocean itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the night. Inside the ship, the warmth of the radiators and the soft glow of the electric lamps created a sanctuary of comfort that felt impenetrable to the cold of the outside world. The engines continued their tireless work, their deep, low-frequency roar becoming a hypnotic lullaby that resonated in the chest of everyone on board. The heat from the boiler rooms was a distant memory in the cool air of the upper decks, where the salt spray would occasionally miss the railings with a fine layer of silver. As the passengers retired to their cabins, the sound of the ship became more intimate, with the occasional creak of wood and the soft whirring of the ventilation system providing a textured silence. The transition from the vibrant social energy of the day to the solitary peace of the night was seamless and soothing. The vastness of the Atlantic was hidden by the darkness, leaving only the immediate reality of the ship's interior, where every detail was designed for rest and tranquility. The heavy silk curtains would be drawn tight against the starlight, creating a private world of shadows and soft textures. The steady pace of the vessel remained unchanged at 22 knots of speed that felt like a glide rather than a struggle against the elements. There was a profound sense of trust in the engineering and the steel that surrounded them, a belief that the modern world had finally mastered the ancient forces of nature. The water ahead remained as smooth as oil, reflecting the stars so perfectly that the ship seemed to be floating in the center of a celestial sphere. Every mile traveled was a quiet victory over distance and time, bringing the travelers closer to the bustling docks of New York while they slept in their floating palace. The smell of the ocean was clean and metallic, mixed with the faint scent of coal smoke that drifted far behind the ship into the empty night. The horizon was a thin line where black of the water met the deep blue of the sky, and in that space there was an overwhelming sense of peace that surpassed understanding. The rhythm of the voyage was slow and steady, progression toward a future that felt bright and certain. The stewards would walk the long carpeted hallways with soft footfalls, ensuring that every light was dimmed and every door was secured. The brass fixtures would catch the stray glints of light and glow with a dull golden luster that added to the feeling of timelessness. As the hours passed, the silence grew deeper, and the vibration of the engine seemed to sink further into the background, becoming part of the natural environment. The dreams of those on board were filled with the images of the day, the sparkling water, the grand meals, and the feeling of being part of something larger than themselves. The Titanic moved forward with a quiet majesty that left no wake of discord, only a trail of fading bubbles in the dark. The air remained still, and the temperature dropped slowly, signaling the presence of the deep Arctic currents that flowed beneath the surface. Yet inside the cabins, the blankets were thick, and the heat was steady, providing a cocoon of safety that allowed for the deepest of slumbers. The ship was a world unto itself, a microcosm of human ambition, and grace drifting through the silent void of the North Atlantic. The stars continued their slow rotation overhead, watching over the ship with a cold and indifferent beauty. The calm was so absolute that it felt as though the ship were standing still while the world moved around it. Every breath taken in the crisp night air was a reminder of the purity of the journey and the simplicity of life at sea. The roar of the engines was a comforting growl that spoke of power used for the benefit of all. The lavish dinners had left a sense of contentment, and the quiet conversations had woven a web of connection between strangers. The ship was more than just a vessel. It was a shared dream of progress and peace, sailing through a night that seemed destined to last forever. As the midnight hour drew near, the atmosphere on board reached a peak of tranquility, where the only motion was the steady heartbeat of machinery and the soft passage of the hull through the mirror, like deep the danger that lay ahead was hidden beneath that perfect surface, invisible to the eye and silent to the ear, leaving the passengers to rest in a state of perfect and unshakable grace. The steel walls were a barrier against the unknown, and the lights of the ship were a beacon of hope in a vast and lonely sea. The journey continued in its rhythmic and boringly beautiful way, a masterpiece of transit that celebrated the quiet moments of the human experience. The water remained flat, and the engines remained steady, and the ship remained the center of the universe for all those within its embrace. The night was long, and the sleep was deep, and the Titanic sailed on into the heart of the quiet Atlantic. The small and cramped wireless room was filled with the rhythmic and hypnotic clicking of the Marconi apparatus as the two young operators sat with their heavy headphones pressed against their ears, listening to the ethereal sounds of the atmosphere. The sparks of the transmitter jumped with a bright blue light and a sharp crackling sound that felt like the only electricity in the middle of the vast and silent ocean. All through the long evening, the airwaves were crowded with the voices of other ships speaking in the staccato language of Morse code, which drifted across the cold Atlantic like invisible birds. The steamer Mesaba sent a steady stream of dots and dashes describing a great wall of ice that lay directly in the path of the giant ship. But the message was just one of many in a sea of electronic noise. The operators were busy sending the private telegrams of the wealthy passengers upstairs who wanted to share their excitement with friends in New York and London, so the urgent warnings about the frozen field were slowly buried under a mountain of trivial greetings and business reports. The rhythmic tapping of the key was a constant and repetitive melody that blended with the low hum of the ship's dynamos, creating a soundscape that was both technical and deeply soothing. On the bridge, the officers' pace was slow and measured tread, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the stars met the water in a line that was perfectly still and impossibly sharp. The temperature continued to drop degree by degree until the air felt like a thin sheet of cold glass against their skin, but the orders remained unchanged as the massive propellers continued to churn the water at 22 knots. There was a quiet and dangerous confidence in the way the steel hull sliced through the mirror-like surface of the sea, because the ship was built to be a fortress, and speed was the ultimate symbol of its power and prestige. The decision to maintain this high velocity, despite the whispered warnings, was not made with shouting or drama, but in the quiet of the chart room where the maps were spread out under a dim green light. The vibration of the engines felt even more intense at this speed, a deep and resonant thrumming that shook the floorboards and lulled the passengers into a deeper state of relaxation. They believed that the sheer momentum of the Titanic could overcome any obstacle that the North Atlantic might throw its way, so they slept soundly in their warm beds, while the ship rushed headlong into the darkness. The warnings from the Caronia and the Baltic were written down on small scraps of paper and placed on the heavy mahogany desk. where they sat in silence as the ship moved further west. The irony of the situation was a quiet tension that only the night could hold, as the contrast between the frantic clicking of the wireless and the steady pace of the vessel grew more pronounced. The wireless room smelled of ozone and hot metal, a sharp and industrial scent that stood in contrast to the salt air outside. The operator's fingers moved with mechanical precision that came from hours of repetitive motion, their minds drifting in and out of the messages as the night wore on. The clicking of the Morse code began to sound like a lullaby, a series of short and long notes that told a story of a world connected by invisible threads of light and sound. Out on the deck, the stillness was absolute, and the lack of wind made the speed of the ship feel like a silent glide through a vacuum of space. The ice was out there waiting in the dark as silent white mountains that reflected no light and made no sound, but the ship continued its march with blind and beautiful grace. The rhythmic sound of water parting at the bow was a soft, hushing noise that seemed to tell the world to remain quiet and still. Every few minutes the wireless would burst into life again with a message from the Californian warning of the ice that had brought their own engines to a halt, but the Titanic was too large and too grand to stop for the whispers of smaller ships. The pride of the Arrow was a heavy and silent weight that kept the levers pushed forward and the coal, fires burning bright in the belly of the ship. The engineers moved in a world of heat and oil, their rhythmic shoveling, creating a heartbeat for the ship that never faltered or slowed. The transition from the frantic electronic warnings to the calm and steady motion of the deck was a strange and dreamlike experience for anyone who understood the risk, but for the passengers it was just another peaceful hour in their journey. The stars above were cold and distant witnesses to the high-speed chase. Across the ocean floor, their light providing no warmth and no warning. The ship was a bubble of human light and noise in an infinite desert of cold water, and the decision to keep moving was a testament to the faith they placed in their own creation. The clicking of the Morse code slowly faded into the background of the mind, becoming just another part of the ship's internal machinery. The fateful choice to maintain speed was woven into the fabric of the night, a quiet thread of destiny that moved as steadily as the ship itself. The air remained motionless, and the sea remained flat as the Titanic approached the invisible line where the ice began. The internal life of the ship was one of luxury and peace, with the soft glow of the lamps and the warmth of the cabins providing a total escape from the reality of the environment. The wireless operators finally leaned back in their chairs of headphones, still humming with the static of the universe, as they took a moment to breathe in the stillness. The messages were there on the table, a silent chorus of warnings that had been delivered but not fully heard, while the ship moved on with majestic and terrifying speed. The rhythm of the engines was a constant and unchanging song of progress, a melody that promised arrival and success at any cost. The darkness of the North Atlantic was a deep and velvet curtain that hid the dangers of the ice field, while the ship's own lights created a false sense of daylight on the water. The journey was a meditation on speed and silence, a slow movement toward a point of no return that felt like the most natural thing in the world. As the clock moved toward the late hours of the evening, the atmosphere of the ship was one of total and absolute calm, where the only motion was the steady vibration of the steel and the silent clicking of the Morse code in the dark. The warnings were left behind like echoes in the wind, and the ship sailed on into the heart of the cold night, with a heart of fire and a soul of iron. The clock on the wall of the grand staircase ticked forward with a rhythmic and mechanical precision, reaching exactly 11:40 p.m. as the world outside remained a void of absolute darkness and crystalline silence. The lookout standing in a high perch of the crow's nest felt the bite of the freezing air against his skin, while his eyes strained to pierce the haze of the horizon, where the stars seemed to touch the very surface of the water. Suddenly a mass of darker shadow emerged from the gloom directly ahead, appearing first as a small smudge against the starlight, before growing into a jagged mountain of ancient ice that reflected no light and made no sound. The lookout reached for the bell and struck it 3 times, a sharp and lonely metallic clang that echoed across the quiet decks and shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the night. He then picked up the phone to the bridge and spoke the words that would change history, while the ship continued its relentless forward motion at 22 knots. On the bridge, the officer acted with a calm and deliberate speed, ordering the engines to stop and the rudder to be turned hard to starboard in a desperate attempt to swing the massive steel hull away from the frozen giant. Deep in the belly of the ship, the vibration of the engines changed from a steady thrum to a low and confused rumble as the steam was diverted, and the propellers began to fight against the momentum of 45,000 tons of moving steel. For a long and breathless minute, it seemed as though the Titanic would slide past the danger in silence as the bow began to swing slowly toward the left. Then came the sound that was not a crash, but a long and sickening grind like the sound of a giant finger being dragged across a wet plate or the tearing of heavy canvas in a distant room. It was a subtle vibration that traveled to the keel of the ship, a scraping noise that lasted for only a few seconds, but felt like an eternity to those who knew what it meant. The ice was harder than the steel, and it sliced through the hull plates like a knife through parchment, popping the rivets and opening the ship to the freezing pressure of the deep Atlantic. Inside the first-class cabins, the fine china rattled slightly on the washstands, and a few passengers felt a gentle jar that nudged them in their sleep, but the ship remained so stable and so grand that most people simply turned over and drifted back into their dreams. Down in the mail room and the lower boiler sections of reality was a sudden and violent rush of green seawater that hissed and swirled as it flooded the dark compartments with an icy weight. The sound of the water was a hollow and haunting roar that filled the spaces where men had been working just moments before in the warmth of the furnaces. The ice had left its mark and then vanished back into the shadows of the night, leaving the Titanic to coast to a slow and final stop in the middle of a mirror-like sea. The sudden silence that followed the stopping of the engines was more terrifying than the noise of the impact, because it signaled that the heartbeat of the great ship had finally ceased. The steam began to roar from the funnels in a deafening white cloud of release of pressure that sounded like a giant screaming into the void of the cosmos. Out on the well deck, small chunks of ice lay scattered across the wood like spilled diamonds reflecting the glow of the electric lights, while the air remained perfectly still and the stars remained perfectly indifferent. The transition from a living, moving palace to a stationary island of steel was complete, and the ship sat motionless on the water, while the freezing Atlantic began to claim its prize inch by inch. The clock still ticked, and the lights still glowed with a warm and deceptive brilliance, but the soul of the ship had been touched by the cold finger of the ice, and nothing would ever be the same again. The passengers in the upper decks looked out their portholes and saw only the flat blackness of the water, wondering why the rhythmic vibration of the voyage had ended so abruptly. The silence was a heavy blanket that draped over the ship as the officers began to realize the extent of the damage hidden beneath the waterline. It was a moment of suspension between the world of the living and the world of the deep, a quiet interlude, where the only sound was the escaping steam and the soft lapping of the water against the wounded hull. The great ship was now a captive of the ocean, held in place by the very ice it had tried to avoid, and the night was only just beginning to reveal its secrets. The sudden cessation of the engines created a silence so profound that it felt like a physical weight pressing against the walls of the staterooms. Across the vast corridors of the first-class decks, passengers stepped out into the hallways, wearing silk robes and curious expressions, wondering why the constant heartbeat of the ship had simply stopped in the middle of the empty ocean. There was no panic, only a polite and sleepy confusion, as people joked about a thrown propeller or a temporary mechanical hiccup, because the idea of the Titanic sinking was as unthinkable as the moon falling from the sky. Some gentlemen even picked up pieces of ice that had fallen onto the deck and began a light-hearted game of soccer under the glow of the electric lamps, laughing as the crystal shards skittered across the polished wood. In the warmth of the smoking room, the players barely looked up from their card games, convinced that the great ship was merely taking a rest before continuing its record-breaking run to New York. However, deep below the surface, the water was already claiming. The mail room and the baggage hold in a silent and relentless surge that turned the air cold and heavy with the scent of wet salt and ancient depths. As the minutes ticked by, a subtle and terrifying change began to take place in the geometry of the ship as the floorboard began to tilt ever so slightly forward, creating a gentle slope that made the walk toward the bow feel different. It was a slow and creeping realization that started in the soles of the feet and moved up through the spine as a massive weight of the water in the front compartments began to pull the nose of the Titanic down into the dark. The stewards moved through the hallways with practiced calm, knocking on doors and asking people to put on their life belts as a precaution, but the passengers still resisted the reality of the situation, preferred the safety of their heated cabins to the biting frost of the open air. The band began to play upbeat ragtime music in the lounge, a cheerful sound that acted as a sonic barrier against the growing dread and kept the atmosphere light even as the incline of the floor grew more pronounced. But out on the deck, the stars seemed to be shifting their positions as the bow dipped lower and lower until water reached the first of the portholes and began to lick at the glass with a cold and hungry tongue. The sight of the dark Atlantic, rising to meet the windows, was the moment the denial began to fracture like thin ice under heat as people watched the white foam swirl around the anchor chains and submerge the forward railings in a silent and graceful drowning. The realization came not as a scream, but as a hushed and collective intake of breath when the realization dawned that the unsinkable ship was losing its battle with gravity. The forward motion of the tilting deck made the marble statues and the heavy furniture shift with a low and ominous groan that echoed through the empty dining saloons. The freezing water was no longer a distant threat, but a rising tide that was slowly swallowing the grand staircase step by step, turning the opulent wood and gold into a drowned graveyard of luxury. The contrast between the brightly lit upper decks and the encroaching blackness of the sea was a visual representation of the end of an era where the comfort of the Gilded Age was being erased by the indifference of nature. Families began to gather on the boat, decked their faces pale and illuminated by the harsh white light of the emergency lamps as they looked down at the dark water that was now so much closer than it had been an hour before. The tilt was now undeniable, making it difficult to stand straight and forcing people to hold on to the brass railings for support as they watched the lifeboats being prepared with mechanical and hollow clatter. The air was so still that every sound carried for miles across the water, the creaking of the ropes, the shouting of orders, and the distant splashing of the rising sea against the steel hull. The bow was now submerged in a deep and velvet embrace of ice water, and the ship seemed to be kneeling before the vastness of the Atlantic as if admitting defeat. The lights continued to burn with a defiant and golden brilliance, casting long reflections on the calm surface of the water. But even their warmth could not hide the fact that the Titanic was slowly disappearing into the deep. The transition from the safety of the interior to the vulnerability of the deck was a passage into a new and terrifying reality, where the only thing that mattered was the steady and silent rise of the ocean. The water was so cold it felt like fire against the skin, but it moved with peaceful and rhythmic flow that was almost hypnotic in its destruction. As the bow sank further, the stern began to lift into the air, exposing the massive propellers to the starlight and creating a silhouette of broken majesty against the horizon. The passengers stood in a trance-like state, watching the water claim the very spaces where they had eaten and laughed only hours before feeling the immense power of the ocean as it reclaimed its territory. The story of the night was shifting from one of luxury to one of survival, but the atmosphere remained hushed and reverent, as if everyone was witnessing a sacred and terrible event. The slow and steady drowning of the ship was a meditation on the fragility of human ambition and the overwhelming strength of the natural world. The silence of the sea was a final answer to the noise of the engines, and the Titanic accepted its fate with a quiet and tragic grace that would haunt the memory of the world forever. The air on the boat deck had turned into a sharp and biting frost that caught in the throats of the hundreds of souls gathered under the cold and indifferent glow of the electric lamps. The wood of the deck was now tilting at a steeper angle, making every step a slow and deliberate effort as families clung to one another with a desperate strength that defied the freezing wind. There was a hushed and heavy atmosphere of heartbreak that hung over the ship as the first of the white lifeboats were swung out over the dark void of the Atlantic. The order of women and children first echoed to the night air not as a shout, but as a somber and final decree that began to tear families apart at the seams of their hearts. Husbands stood with their hands shoved deep into their overcoat pockets, trying to keep their voices steady as they looked into the tear-filled eyes of their wives and promised they would see them again on the docks of New York. The goodbye kisses were brief and frantic, tasting of salt and cold air, while the children were lifted by their armpits into the swaying boats, as if they were being tucked into bed for a long and uncertain nap. The creaking of the ropes and the rhythmic clicking of the winches were the only sounds that accompanied these silent tragedies as the lifeboats began their long and shaky descent into blackness below. Many women refused to leave their husbands, choosing to stay on the tilting deck and share whatever fate the ocean had in store rather than face a future in a world that felt suddenly empty and cold. The social barriers of the voyage had completely melted away, leaving only the raw and vulnerable reality of human love and the primal instinct to protect those who were smallest and weakest. In the lower decks, the scramble was becoming more frantic as the realization of the limited space began to spread like a cold current through the crowd. The iron gates that had Separated the classes were now being bypassed or broken as people sought any path to the upper decks, where the lifeboats offered a flickering hope of survival. There was a desperate movement in. The shadows as men and women from every corner of the world clutched their few belongings or simply held on to each other, while the water continued to rise with a silent and terrifying patience. The lights of the ship were still burning with a golden and deceptive warmth, casting long and flickering shadows across the faces of those who knew they would not find a seat in the boats. Even in the midst of this quiet desperation, there were moments of profound and selfless grace as strangers helped one another over the railings, and fathers handed their infant children to women they had never met before begging them to keep the little ones safe. The band continued to play, their instruments their fingers stiff from the cold, but their music providing a steady and rhythmic anchor for the drifting spirits of the crowd. The sound of the violins was a thin and beautiful thread of humanity that stretched out across the dark water, connecting those in the boats to those left behind on the iron mountain of the ship. As the last of the wooden lifeboats disappeared into the mist, the silence on the deck grew deeper and more reverent, as if the world were holding its breath for the end of a long and tragic dream. The scramble for the remaining collapsible rafts was a slow-motion struggle against gravity, and the encroaching sea where the freezing water was now splashing against the very boards where people stood. Every goodbye whispered on that deck was a testament to a lifetime of memories being compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity and sorrow. The stars above remained steady and bright, watching the tiny lights of the lifeboats drift away like sparks from a dying fire, until the Titanic felt like a solitary island of light in a universe of shadow. The emotion of the night was not found in loud cries, but in the quiet gripping of hands, and the steady gaze of those who accepted that their journey was coming to an end. The ship was now groaning under the immense pressure of the water, filling its lungs, and the tilt was so great that the sea began to wash over the forward boat deck in a rhythmic and icy surge. The limited seats in the boats were gone, leaving hundreds to stand in the stillness of the North Atlantic night, waiting for the final curtain to fall on the most opulent stage ever built. The memory of those goodbyes would linger in the air like a ghost long after the water had claimed the steel and the silk and the wood. The love that was expressed in those final minutes was the true heart of the story, a warmth that even the freezing ocean could not fully extinguish as the ship prepared for its final and silent plunge into the deep. The rhythmic lapping of the water grew louder, and the music played on, and the stars watched over the quiet tragedy of the human heart in the middle of the empty sea. The air was a biting frost that seemed to turn the very breath of the sailors into silver mist, but deep within the vibrating heart of the Titanic, the engineers and firemen stood amidst the roaring heat of the furnaces and the rhythmic thrumming of the massive dynamos. They knew the water was rising and the steel was groaning under the weight of the Atlantic, but they remained at their stations with a quiet and stoic resolve that was as steady as the machinery they tended. Their boots were soaked in the icy brine that seeped through the floorboards, yet they continued to shovel coal and turn the heavy brass valves to ensure that the golden glow of the electric lights never flickered for the people above. The lights were a symbol of hope and safety in the middle of the dark wilderness, and as long as the engineers could keep the steam flowing, the ship remained a beacon of civilization against the encroaching void. The sound of the engines had changed from a confident roar to a labored and rhythmic gasping as the pumps fought a losing battle against the ocean, but the men worked in a focused silence that was almost meditative in its intensity. Meanwhile, on the slanting deck, the 8 musicians of the ship's band gathered their instruments and stood together under the cold starlight to perform their final and most beautiful concert. Their fingers were stiff and numb from a freezing wind, yet they moved across the strings of the violins and the keys of the cello with a grace that felt supernatural and divine. The music they chose was not frantic or loud, but consisted of slow and rhythmic waltzes and hymns that drifted across the mirror like water, like a soft blanket of sound to comfort the souls of the frightened. The melody of Songe d'Automne and Near My God to be blended with the distant splashing of the rising sea and the low groan of the tilting hull, creating a haunting symphony of courage and sacrifice. They played with a steady cadence that ignored the gravity, pulling the bow deeper into the deep blue while the passengers looked on in a trance of gratitude and sorrow. The music acted as a psychological anchor, preventing the spread of panic and allowing the final lifeboats to be lowered with a sense of order and dignity that would be remembered for a century. Deep below the surface, the engineers were now standing waist deep in the freezing water, but they refused to leave the switches and the boilers until the very last moment of the ship's life there. Sacrifice was a silent one hidden behind the steel walls and the rising tide, yet every bulb that stayed lit on the mast was a testament to their unwavering loyalty to their duty. The band continued to play even as the water began to swirl around their feet on the deck, their eyes fixed on the horizon, and their instruments crying out with a voice that was both fragile and immortal. The notes of the music seemed to hang in the still air for an eternity before being carried away by the wind into the vast emptiness of the North Atlantic. The contrast between the warmth of the music and the coldness of the water was a profound expression of the human spirit's refusal to be silenced by the indifference of nature. As the ship reached its final angle, and the lights finally began to dim to a deep and reddish glow, the musicians shared a quiet look of mutual respect before the ocean finally claimed the space where they stood. The engineers had stayed until the lights went out, and the musicians had played until the water stopped the strings, and together they formed the soul of the Titanic's final hour. Their rhythmic commitment to their craft was a lullaby for the dying ship and a comfort for those drifting in the lifeboats far away, who could still hear the faint and beautiful echoes of the violins across the waves. The silence that followed their final note was not empty, but full of the resonance of their bravery, which remained etched into the atmosphere like a ghost of harmony. The story of the band and the engineers is a tribute to the quiet and boringly consistent nature of true heroism, where the only reward is the knowledge that one has done their best until the end. The stars watched over the spot where the music had been, and the water closed over the place where the fires had burned, leaving only the memory of light that refused to go out until the world itself turned dark. The journey of the Titanic was over, but the song of its defenders remained a steady and calming pulse in the heart of history. The rhythm of the night was now composed of the soft lapping of the water and the distant twinkling of the stars, while the ship settled into its final and eternal rest on the ocean floor. The clock on the wall of the world had reached exactly 2:20 a.m. as the grand silhouette of the Titanic stood almost vertical against the backdrop of a billion silent stars. The massive weight of the stern hung suspended in the air for a long and breathless moment, while the internal machinery of the ship broke loose and crashed forward into the depths with a distant and muffled roar that vibrated through the very surface of the sea. Then, with a slow and rhythmic grace that felt more like a descent into a dream than a disaster, the great steel mountain began to slide backward into the velvet blackness of the North Atlantic. The water closed over the last of the railings with a soft and hushing sound like a long drawn-out sigh of a giant finally finding its bed on the ocean floor. As the bubbles rose to the surface and the ship disappeared from view, a profound and absolute silence fell over the water, a silence so heavy and deep that it seemed to stretch from the bottom of the sea to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. The surface of the ocean returned to its mirror-like state, reflecting the cold and indifferent light of the heavens, as if the largest ship ever built had never existed at all. In the water, the struggle was a slow and rhythmic movement of hundreds of souls fighting against a cold so intense it felt like a physical weight crushing the breath in their lungs. The temperature of the water was just below freezing, a temperature that turned the sea into a liquid desert of ice and shadow. There were no waves to wash over them, only the gentle and hypnotic undulation of the deep sea swell that carried the survivors further away from each other into the darkness. The lifeboats drifted like tiny wooden islands in the distance, their occupants watching the empty spot on the horizon where the lights had been just moments before. The transition from the noise and light of the ship to the total darkness of the open sea was a meditation on the fragility of human life and the overwhelming power of the natural world. The survivors in the water clung to pieces of wreckage and wooden doors, their movements becoming slower and more rhythmic as the cold began to pull them into a state of deep and final exhaustion. The air was so still that the sound of a single breath could be heard for miles across the water, and the stars seemed to watch with steady and unwavering gaze that offered no comfort but a sense of eternal perspective. The silence was not empty, but full of the hushed whispers of those who were drifting between worlds, their voices fading into the white noise of the ocean. Every minute that passed was a slow and steady progression toward a sleep that would never end for many while. Those in the boat sat in a trance of shock and sorrow. The rhythmic lapping of the water against the sides of the lifeboats was a steady and hollow sound that marked the passage of time in a world where time no longer had any meaning. The struggle in the water was not a frantic one, but a quiet and fading effort, as the energy of life was slowly absorbed by the immense and icy heat of the Atlantic. The stars reflected in the water made it seem as though they were floating in the middle of a celestial sphere where there was no up and no down, only the infinite blue of the night. As the hours toward dawn began to crawl forward, the silence grew even deeper as the last of the ripples from the sinking faded away into the horizon. The ocean was a vast and lonely cathedral, where the only prayer was the steady and rhythmic pulse of the tides. The cold was a blanket that wrapped around everyone and everything, turning the struggle into a silent surrender to the elements. The lifeboats were scattered across miles of ocean, but they were all connected by the same shared experience of the dark and the silence. The memory of the ship was already beginning to fade into the mist of the past, leaving only the reality of the freezing water and the distant hope of a rescue that seemed impossible. The water remained flat, and the air remained breathless, and the world remained at peace in its own tragic and beautiful way. The final plunge of the Titanic was not an end, but a transformation from a thing of steel and light into a legend of shadow and memory. The silence that followed was the ultimate tribute to the scale of the loss and the majesty of the sea. The rhythmic movement of survivors grew slower and slower until it matched the slow rotation of the earth itself. The night was long and the cold was absolute, and the ocean held its secrets with a quiet and terrifying grace. The stars continued to shine with a cold brilliance, illuminating the empty space where the dreams of thousands had been cast into the deep. The journey was over, and the rest was a long and silent sleep beneath the gaze of the northern sky. The first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon with a pale and ghostly luminescence as the RMS Carpathia emerged from the morning mist like a silent messenger of mercy, moving through a sea of floating ice that glowed with a cold and eerie brilliance under the fading stars. The rhythmic thrumming of its engines was a steady and comforting sound for survivors huddled in the small wooden lifeboats, who watched as the ship's massive hull grew larger against the indigo sky. There were no cheers or shouts, only a profound and heavy silence as the first of the weary travelers were hoisted onto the deck, wrapped in warm blankets and given cups of steaming coffee that smelled of wood smoke and hope. The transition from the freezing isolation of the Atlantic to the safe embrace of the Carpathia was a slow and dreamlike process where time seemed to stretch and fold until the tragedy felt like a distant memory rather than a recent reality. As the ship turned toward New York, carrying its burden of sorrow, the news began to ripple across the wireless airwaves, reaching the bustling streets of Manhattan and the quiet parlors of London with the force of a tidal wave that stopped the world in its tracks. The global mourning was a deep and resonant chord that vibrated through every level of society as flags were lowered to half-mast, and the newspapers were printed with thick black borders that framed the names of the lost in a gallery of regret. In the United States, the tragedy left a permanent scar on the national psyche, ending an era of blind faith in technology and replacing it with a quiet and sober realization of the power of the natural world. The American public gathered in the thousands at the docks in the pouring rain, waiting for the Carpathia to arrive, their faces illuminated by the flickering street lamps as they looked for loved ones who would never walk down the gangplank. This collective grief led to a profound and rhythmic shift in the way the world looked at the sea, resulting in new maritime safety laws that mandated lifeboats for every soul on board and the constant monitoring of wireless frequencies so that no ship would ever be alone in the dark again. The Ice Patrol was established as a permanent sentinel of the North Atlantic, watching over the shipping lanes with a steady and watchful eye to ensure that the silence of the night would never be broken by such a grind of steel again. The Titanic itself settled into a long and peaceful sleep 2 miles beneath the surface, where the pressure is immense and the light of the sun never reaches the rusted plates of its once magnificent hull. Down in the deep blue silence, the ship became a monument to a vanished age of elegance and ambition, covered in slow-growing rusticless that looked like frozen tears of iron. The rhythm of the ocean floor is one of eternal stillness, where the only movement is the gentle sway of deep-sea currents and the slow drift of marine snow falling like dust in a deserted cathedral. The story of the Titanic moved from the headlines into the realm of legend, becoming a cautionary tale whispered to children as they drifted off to sleep, a reminder that even the greatest of human achievements must bow before the vastness of the universe. The American dream of the 20th century was tempered by this loss, becoming more grounded and more resilient as the lessons of the disaster were woven into the fabric of daily life. The names of the captains and the engineers and the musicians became part of a shared history that celebrates the quiet dignity of duty and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the years passed, the tragedy became a soft and fading echo, a melody of bronze and salt that resonates to the halls of museums and the pages of books. The world moved on into a new era of flight and light, but the memory of the great ship remained a steady and calming presence in the back of the mind to anchor a perspective in a fast-changing world. The silence of the Atlantic is now a protected and sacred thing, holding the dreams of the past in A, cradle of cold water and starlight. Every night as the sun sets over the ocean, the legacy of the Titanic is whispered by the waves in a rhythmic and repetitive song of remembrance and peace. The ship is at rest and the world is at rest, and the story has finally found its end in the quiet embrace of history.